Hi, this is Alessio. Hope you're well. This will be quite an important video because many have been asking for this specific subject. So what I'm going to do in this video is try and answer two important questions. Firstly, is it likely the markets will crash this year, or will they move towards all-time highs? So that's the first question. The second question is, if the worst case scenario happens, at what point am I prepared to sell and get out of the market, assuming that a crash is about to start? In other words, how can we know that a potential bear market or a crash is about to start? And how likely is it? And by the way, in case you're wondering, why are we talking about the chart of the stock markets? Why not Bitcoin? Because as you know, what happens to the major stock markets also has a major impact on Bitcoin and crypto as well. All right, guys, join me. Alright guys, welcome back. So we've got a lot to talk about in this particular video. We're going to take a look at the chart of the stock markets and discuss what is the more likely path for the markets. And again, at what point am I prepared to sell and exit the market if the worst case scenario happens? Now before we talk about the markets, there's something quite important I need to mention here. As you know, some months ago this year, I was on a holiday abroad in Iran, which was an amazing time. Now, while I was over there, I saw this poor abandoned dog, which you see here is a photo I took. And this poor dog essentially was hungry and had a cancerous growth on its body. It was in a terrible situation. So I quickly called one of my friends who's a vet, and we managed to rescue the dog and take it to a clinic. Fortunately, after giving the dog some food and also treatment with chemotherapy, the dog is actually okay now. In fact, here's a recent video of that same dog doing quite well. I'm only glad we managed to find him in time. The dog even has a name now. It's called Shere Khan, which means Mr. Lion because of its fur. So why am I telling you all this? A couple of years ago, I asked you if you're okay with me doing sponsored ads in my videos if I donate the money to help the poor or abandoned starving animals. 78% of you said yes, you're okay with that, and I want to thank you for that. So I hope you'll continue to support me in helping these animals, because any money I get from these sponsored videos, I give that to buy food, shelter, and treatment for stray and starving animals like the dog I just talked about. All you have to do is watch this sponsored promotion. And if you like it, if it appeals to you, try it out. Click on the link in the description and see it for yourself. That is all I ask. So let me tell you a little bit about our sponsor, Masterworks. As I'm sure you know, the markets can be volatile and extremely unpredictable. And by that I mean most markets, like stock markets, gold, and Bitcoin. We have already seen big ups and downs this year in Bitcoin, precious metals, and recently in stock markets. As it turns out, fine art is one of the few assets that is not subject to huge volatility. It is relatively more stable. The reason is that art has a low correlation to other major assets. That is why blue chip contemporary art has now outpaced the S&P 500 for the last 27 years by an impressive 136%. Most people completely ignore fine art as an investment because they mistakenly think it's only for the mega rich. That is wrong. Masterworks allows ordinary people like you and I, to learn about the art market and invest in shares of art. So when they sell a painting, the net proceeds are passed on to their investors. By the way, Masterworks have sold 16 paintings to date, all of them profitable to investors. Now I want to make it clear, this video is not a recommendation to buy or invest in any asset such as fine art. This video is only for educational purposes, and there are risks as with any investment. I'm just saying there are other ways to diversify, and we need to be open-minded. As for Masterworks, they have over 300 paintings in their collection with over 800,000 users. Masterworks remains as the only art platform in the world offering museum-grade blue-chip art. Getting started with Masterworks is very simple. Simply click on the link in the description for priority access. Then just set up an account in a few seconds and browse their artwork. Let me say again that any money we get from sponsors is given to charity, such as helping abandoned animals like the dog I talked about earlier in the video. Alright guys, let's get back to the video and talk about the markets. So at the beginning of this video, I asked two important questions. Firstly, how likely is it for the stock markets to crash this year and fall into a bear market? Or actually, is it more likely the markets will move towards all-time highs? And the second question was, if the worst case scenario happens, at what point am I prepared to sell and exit the market completely? In other words, how can we know that we're about to start a major crash and fall into a bear market? And also, how likely is that? So let me just begin by saying that, as I'm sure you're aware, if you've been watching my videos and also our member videos, I've been consistently bullish on the market since the beginning of this year. In fact, since January this year, while most analysts out there on YouTube and on social media have been extremely bearish, calling for a major crash at the beginning of this year, I've remained consistently bullish and optimistic for the markets from the beginning of this year. Now, of course, the markets did rally higher as we had expected from the beginning of this year to July, and in fact, the S&P hit several of our targets. Now, as the markets were rallying towards 4,500, 4,600 in July, I began to warn our members about a potential correction and a drop in the stock markets. In fact, here's a clip. If the S&P should see a much more deeper retracement, which is entirely probable, In other words, if this level does not hold at 4,393, then that's the next support that's going to be tested between 4,330 to 4,300. So those are my most likely support levels for the S&P to test in the next several weeks and potentially next few months, taking us to the end of August, probably September. By the way, let me mention again, that's only if the S&P stays below 4,512, and breaks down. I want to see confirmation. Again, confirmation is necessary here, especially if the S&P then breaks down below 4,430. Breaking down below this level, 4,430, then the odds increase for a move down into this region, as I mentioned, 4,325 to 4,270. All right, guys, thanks for watching that. In fact, the S&P has managed to now pull back and drop to the key levels, some of the key regions we talked about in the member videos, in the key support levels. By the way, let me just mention one thing. I'm not trying to tell you that I got every single movement in the market correct. I did not. But overall, in the big picture, I think I got more right than wrong. Now, as I'm making this video right now, the S&P is just hovering around 4,300. So the first question is, am I still bullish on the markets for the remainder of this year? Or do I expect something really bad, like a major crash? So if you saw the title of this video, you're probably thinking that it must be very bearish. That is not the case. As a matter of fact, I still remain bullish for the remainder of this year. And I think the stock markets in the next several months are likely to reach all-time highs. Now, I don't know exactly when they're going to reach all-time highs. It could be by December, or it could be in the next 4 to 6 months. The fact is, I still think it's much more likely for the stock markets to rally higher and move towards the all-time highs. I should add, by the way, that when the stock market, when the S&P reached near 4,600 back in July, it was only 5% away from its all-time highs near 4,818. And as for the full reasons and explanation as to why I remain bullish on the stock markets, I've given that in the member video, so make sure you go ahead and watch the member videos. But in any case, that is my view. So let me just repeat one more time. I do not expect a crash or a bear market this year in 2023. I still remain bullish for the remainder of this year. I still think this drop we're seeing in the stock market is a temporary correction before the next major rally ensues and starts towards all-time highs in the next several months. Again, probably by the end of December, or if not this year, perhaps by the start of next year. I think it's much more likely for the stock markets to continue the uptrend towards all-time highs. Okay, now the question I want to ask is this, and the question you're probably wondering is, well, Alessio, what if you're wrong? So that's the key question here. At what point will I be able to say, no, I'm probably wrong about my bullish expectation on the stock market and change my mind and become bearish? So the key question is, at what point will I sell and exit the market in case I'm wrong? So have a look at this chart. This is a chart of the stock market, the S&P here. Notice this nice uptrend line shown in magenta. This is the purple line you see on my chart. A nice uptrend line you can see by connecting those lows going all the way back to October of last year. So clearly we can see on this chart that the stock market remains at the moment in an uptrend. So that in itself is a very simple reason as to why I remain bullish and optimistic for the stock market. And I think as long as the stock market remains above this uptrend line, the odds favor the uptrend to continue. Now notice on my chart there's a red line here. There's a horizontal red line at about 4,200, 4,180. This is actually a very important critical level. If the S&P were to drop and fall below both the trend line, the magenta trend line you see on my chart, and the red line, the horizontal red line at about 4,180, then I would have no choice but to change my mind about my bullish expectation for the stock market. In other words, if the S&P were to break down below those levels, that important key level, about 4,180 on the chart, that would be the first warning sign, a major warning sign that something is not right in the market, and I would then have to look at a second chart for confirmation. I'll tell you about the second chart in a few minutes. But just to make sure I make this point very clear, as long as the stock market remains above this support level, these support levels above the trend line and above 4,180, I have no reason to be bearish on the stock market. But if the stock market, if the S&P were to break down below both these levels, below the trend line and below 4,180, then that would be a strong warning sign. By the way, in case you're wondering why 4,180, why 4,200 that level, because essentially if the stock market were to drop down into that level below 4,180, it would create an overlap with the previous wave or rally in the market, and the overlap would be a warning sign. Now, the second chart we need to look at for confirmation, and confirmation is very important here. The second chart is the Dow Transportation Index. Now, as I'm sure you know from my previous videos, the Dow Transportation can be a very important and useful leading indicator for the market. In fact, my good friend and trader Manuel Blythe at dowtheory.com, he does use the Transportation Index as an important clue for the overall markets. Why? Because transportation is very sensitive to shifts in the economy. So as I'm sure you know, there are two key components in the economy. One is manufacturing stuff, making stuff, The second is shipping stuff or taking stuff. All right. So that's why we need to look at transportation, because it's an important factor in the economy. So let's have a look at the transportation index, the Dow Transportation Index on this chart. If the Dow Transportation Index were to drop below this trend line, notice there's a trend line running through here, an uptrend line, by the way, which is a good sign, by the way, for this chart. If the Dow Transportation Index can remain above this trend line, that's a good sign. However, if, and I want to stress, if the Dow Transportation Index were to break down below both the trend line, the uptrend line, and below this important support level, this horizontal red line in this chart, which is about 14,460, that would be a major red flag. That would not be good. Because if the Dow Transportation Index were to drop and fall below, if it was to make a sustained break of that support level at 14,460, that would be a major red flag that something is not right in the stock markets and perhaps overall in the economy as well. So remember, this important chart is a leading indicator for both the stock markets and the economy. So in other words, guys, as to the question that I asked at the beginning of this video, at what point would I sell and exit the market? Let me just say again, this is unlikely. I'm not expecting this to happen. So I'm not expecting a crash or bear market scenario. It has a low probability in my view. Again, I've given full explanations in the member videos. But the fact is, if the Dow Transportation Index were to break down below 14,460, and if the S&P were to break down and close below 4180 on that chart, then if both of those things happen, then I will have no choice but to change my mind and become very bearish on the stock markets. Again, let me mention one more time. I don't think that bear market scenario is going to happen. I'm not bearish on the markets. I am not expecting a crash. I remain bullish for the stock markets for the remainder of this year, and I think it's much more likely for the stock markets to rally higher and move towards all-time highs. All I'm saying is that if the stock market, if the S&P were to drop and fall below 4180, and if the Dow Transportation Index were to confirm that to fall below its support level at 14,460, then I will have no choice but to change my mind and become very bearish on the markets and potentially sell and exit the markets. By the way, one important disclaimer. This video is not a recommendation to buy or sell into the stock market or any market. I'm just simply saying to you, this is what I'm going to be doing for myself to manage risk. This is by no means a recommendation. You should do the same thing as me. All right, guys, so I'm just simply letting you know what I'm going to be doing for the next several months and what my expectations are. And let me say again, I could be wrong about my overall expectations. But as I mentioned earlier, I remain bullish and optimistic for the stock markets for the remainder of this year. And I'm looking for much higher levels for the markets to be reached in the next several months. All right, guys, hope this video has helped. And also let me know in the comments what you think. Do you agree with me or disagree with me? And by the way, guys, make sure you watch our next members video. We're going to go into the markets, again, the stock markets, gold, Bitcoin in a lot more detail. And if you're not a member, you can join on that link you see right there. Thank you very much indeed. Bye for now.